Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 69 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Tampa Bay Lightning, in which the Sharks have lost 4-1. This the first game back at home after yet another long Eastern road trip that saw the Sharks lose every single one of those games, so hoping to get a bit of positivity back into the team here with a very tough matchup against the Tampa Bay Lightning. Reminder that the first time these two teams met much earlier on this season, the Sharks got crushed by a score of 6-0, a game in which they literally had zero chance of ever winning at any point in those 60 minutes. So here tonight, you could really only go up from there, one would think, and the Sharks actually put up a very good fight. Yes, on the scoreboard here at the end of the game, it is a 4-1 loss, doesn't look particularly impressive, but how this game actually played out was quite solid for the Sharks. In the first period, it would be Tampa Bay who would strike first to make it 1-0 with a goal from Nick Paul, but this was a pretty lucky one that I believe goes off of the skate of a referee and goes straight in front for Paul, so this is not something that the Sharks could have necessarily defended against better, as this puck should have been rimmed around the boards and just suddenly came out in front for the easy tap-in goal for the Lightning, and that would only be one of their 4 shots in the entire first period. The Sharks would end up tying the game pretty soon after with a goal from William Eklund to make it 1-1 at the end of the first period. In the second period, the Sharks would continue to play some pretty solid defense. Now, you could argue for sure that it was more so the Lightning who really weren't playing particularly well, more so than it was the San Jose Sharks playing suffocating defensively, but still, the stats do speak for themselves as they limit the Lightning, I believe it is just 5 or 6 shots in the second period, to have a grand total of 10 at the end of 40 minutes. And so the Sharks would then head into this third period in a tied at 1 game, with an opportunity, if they win the third period, they could then win this game, and like I said, get some more positivity in an organization that has had very little of it thus far this season. But against a team like the Lightning, a veteran team that knows what it takes to win, as well as a team that is looking to still make a strike to make it into the postseason, where at that point anything is possible for such a seasoned group, the Lightning come out, they know what they have to do in the third period, and they just absolutely take it to the San Jose Sharks. The Sharks, they fall off a cliff, they give up a bunch of shots, and for the second straight game, they give up multiple goals here in the third period without managing to score one themselves, as it starts off with a point on the power play, a penalty that was taken by the San Jose Sharks in the dying seconds of the previous period. Then it is Anthony Duclair in his first game back in San Jose since being traded near the deadline just a couple of weeks ago. He went from playing with Mikael Granlund and Fabian Zetterlund on the Sharks' top line, which, to be fair, those players are pretty decent, but now he's playing on the top line with the Lightning with Nikita Kucherov, the league's leading scorer, and Braden Point, who just scored his 40th goal of the season. A pretty small difference, to say the least, between those line mates. So Duclair has had immense success with Tampa Bay since arriving. He ends up with the 3-1 goal, and then Braden Point with that 40th, as I mentioned, makes it 4-1 Tampa Bay, and the Sharks never really have much of a chance of actually getting back into this game. Their singular goal will stand for the rest of it, and as such lose the game 4-1. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Zetterlund, Granlund, and Kostin. Not the best game for this group of players, matching up against some really tough players against the Tampa Bay Lightning, not in terms of physically tough, but just skilled from the Tampa Bay side, and these players just couldn't really keep up. The player who impressed me the most on the top line, at the very least this game, was actually Klim Kostin here. He actually has surprisingly good vision in his game, which was quite nice to see. He didn't necessarily strike me as the type of player who would be a playmaker or anything like that, but there were multiple passes, in particular during the early parts of this game in the first period, where you don't even see them before Kostin does, and I've got the bird's eye view compared to him, who has to view it in more of a first-person sense. So generally, I was definitely impressed with some of the passes that he made, but his two line mates, not the best of games for them, neither Granlund nor Zetterlund. When it comes to the second line, we finally had a change, and maybe one that came to a bit of a surprise to some people, something I'll mention a bit later on when we get to this player. But for now, the second line consisted of Kun and Zadina being joined by Barabanov. Barabanov was a healthy scratch in the previous game, gets back into the lineup here and immediately into the top six, I guess if you want to call it that, considering it's pretty hard to describe this group of players as a second line by any NHL standards. And I will say at the very least they were better as a group, with Barabanov in place of William Eklund. They were better as a group than they were in the previous game, because at the very least they weren't a massive defensive liability, mostly because the Lightning for the first couple of periods really didn't do much of anything. But in terms of actually generating offense, which is something that you want from your second line, they still didn't actually get anything done. They had a couple of moments where it looked like they'd get a scoring chance, but really nothing ever materialized from those, and so this was once again a pretty disappointing game from the second line. When it comes to the third line, we have that one kept together. Sturm Bordeleau once again being joined by Justin Bailey, and this is just something that I'm not really a huge fan of, because over these past few games I have consistently praised the performances of both Sturm and in particular Thomas Bordeleau, as I do think they managed to generate some decent offensive zone time and set of chances, but I just feel as though the third man on this line, Justin Bailey, is not really doing a great job of complementing the other two players, which ends up making this third line not particularly effective. They still do a rather solid job defensively, which is quite nice to see, especially since Bordeleau is actually pulling his weight in a lot of these situations, but from an offensive perspective, there just isn't enough of a cohesiveness, and that is primarily because I don't think Bailey is really good enough to be on this third line, or any third line for that matter. He fit in quite well when he was playing on the Sharks' fourth line, and that's where he has spent the majority of the season, but sometimes you get that promotion, it doesn't work out, and you gotta be sent back down. Currently, David Quinn is sticking with this, which I feel is for a bit too long, and hopefully some sort of substitution can come from that, because like I said, once again, a solid game for both Sturm and Bordeleau, but Bailey left a bit to be desired. And then we get to the fourth line, and this is where we had the change, and this is Eklund joining Ryan Carpenter and Jacob McDonald on the fourth line. Now, a couple of months ago, if you told me that William Eklund would be demoted to the fourth line, I would have been very upset. I would have said, wow, David Quinn showing the classic amount of too much tough love, so to speak, to a young player, yada yada yada, all of that. And if it had happened 2 months ago, I would have indeed echoed those sentiments. But today, in this particular game, I actually didn't have that much of a problem with it. Eklund really has not been good over these last couple of weeks. And while it should also still be noted that neither Zadina nor Kunnin have been good either, and in fact, of the three players, I would say Eklund has been the best, though that is not saying much, which means if we follow that logic, both Kunnin and Zadina should also get demotions, but we can't really live in a perfect world like that, because the Sharks don't really have much better options in that particular position. And so if you're going to choose a player to try and send a message to, it is probably smart to be Eklund, just because he is the player who you would hope would be the most receptive to this type of criticism, as he is pretty much the most important player currently on the San Jose Sharks forward roster at this point. And so he gets demoted down to the fourth line, and he immediately pays off well for David Quinn with the only goal for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. I don't necessarily think he was as great as he has been at times this season. He's had some really, really good games this year, but considering the position that he's in on this fourth line, he's not exactly playing with the most offensively gifted players. Ryan Carpenter is a career fourth liner, and Jacob McDonald isn't even a forward, yet is playing in the forward position. The fact that Eklund ends up having a decent amount of success in this position is a very nice response to the really bad games that he has had recently, and it goes to show once more that Eklund in this wing position, compared to the center position that he has been played at since the injuries to both Hertl and Logan Couture after the All-Star break, is much more preferable. When it comes to the other two players on his line, Jacob McDonald, always a very hit or miss guy. Sometimes he'll have a really solid game, sometimes he'll just be completely bad, which is why I do prefer McDonald in the forward role. This is because if he does have one of those very bad games, which is pretty much like every other game that he plays, at the very least he's not doing so in a defensive role, which can be much more terrible for the Sharks from a goals against perspective. if he's having a bad game on the fourth line, well, you could just give him like 6 minutes in the night and not really have any ill effects from it. So pretty good game for McDonald for sure. Eklund also the driving force of this fourth line. Good response from him. Moving on to the defense. This was a strong start to the night for the Sharks defense through the first couple of periods, as I mentioned, the Lightning with only 10 shots on goal, and this is a big reason why this defense actually looked quite good through the first 40 minutes. In particular, Mario Ferraro started this game off very, very well and was looking quite good. The major problem for Ferraro is he was the one given the majority of the shifts against the Lightning top line of Kucherov, Point, and Duclair, and in the third period, when that line woke up and managed to put up 3 goals here, at least 2 at even strength, and then 1 on the power play, Ferraro found himself on the ice for a couple of those, and on other shifts in which Kucherov managed to dominate, Ferraro was again on the ice. And so, while it started off exceptionally well, once actually tasked with covering some of these best players in the NHL, he unsurprisingly was not really up to the challenge all that well. So technically, at the end of the day, it wasn't a great game for Ferraro, but it's hard to fault him too much, considering Kucherov is the league leader in terms of points. He is managing to put up multiple points against pretty much every single team in the league. In fact, his previous game was against the Vegas Golden Knights, the defending Stanley Cup champions, and he had 4 points against them as well. So it's hard to fault Ferraro too much. The same would have to be said about the Sharks' second pairing, Ruta and Thrun. One thing is for sure, they have had a massive rebound from the previous night, in which they were just completely awful against the Nashville Predators. Thrun started this game out rather well, still also, like with Ferraro, had some issues in the third periods once the Lightning actually turned things on, but again, somewhat of an excusable type of situation here. When it comes to the third defensive pairing, this is the only one that managed to stay relatively consistent throughout the night, just because the Lightning's bottom pairing or bottom lines, third and their fourth lines, in which this group actually felt most of their competition was, They were not really rolling all that much in the third period. It was mostly these couple of top lines for the Lightning that got all of these fantastic chances. And so Vlasic still managed to look pretty good. Addison, on the other hand, it wasn't the worst game I've ever seen him play. There have been many of those. But on one of these goals, which was the Anthony Duclair one, it feels as though Addison, once again, abandoning his defensive positioning, not really keeping in mind of what the play could develop into, and is more so just watching what the play currently is. And so that ends up as a mistake in the back of the Sharks net against the former San Jose Sharks player. So again, there's not really anything great here with his game. And then finally we get to the goaltender, that being Mackenzie Blackwood, finally returning from his injury, so that does relieve Magnus Krona of his starting duties with the San Jose Sharks. Krona actually sent back down to the Barracuda, so the Sharks seem to be going for the rest of the season with a Blackwood and Devin Cooley duo, Devin Cooley and Mackenzie Blackwood tandem here. And I thought Blackwood actually had a decent game, I guess. He wasn't really tasked with making many saves through the first couple of periods. The only one that he did let in, he had literally 0 chance on, as it would be exceptionally difficult to have tracked that puck in the Nick Paul situation. When it comes to these other 3 goals, both of these Braden Point ones are pretty tough to save. This is a really good scorer in a really good position, and the Duclair one is also a pretty tough one, so I can't put too much blame onto Mackenzie Blackwood for how this game ended up going up. It was just a third period in which the Sharks were once again, for the 100th time this season, or I guess I should say the 69th time this season pretty much, they were outclassed. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will face off again against the Chicago Blackhawks. I played up the importance of their matchup with the Blackhawks that was just a few days ago, and that continues here in the third and final meeting between these two teams, with the Sharks lost tonight and the Blackhawks also in action and losing to the Anaheim Ducks here tonight. The Sharks remain 4 points behind the Blackhawks for that last place spot in the league. I imagine that with that being game 70 for San Jose, if they once again lose in regulation to Chicago, giving themselves a 6-point cushion, it would be pretty difficult with the way that the Sharks are playing recently for them to relinquish that last place spot in the league. On the other hand, if they actually manage a regulation win and they pull within 2 points of the Chicago Blackhawks, it's an entirely new race for that last place spot. So once again, in the Sharks' best interest to lose that game. Class dismissed.